Let's discuss a few things relevant to the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas. I call it the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas, by the way, to underline the fact that I'm not claiming that the extant work is in any respect the ancient Gospel of Barnabas, of which there are 2 notices in ancient Christian texts. But I also want to deflect proposals that the work is entirely a fiction of the early modern period, the 1590s or thereabouts. The construction, the imagery, the mindset is earlier and must properly be called medieval. Sections of the work seem to allude to events in the early 1300s. It certainly has medieval interests, and its roots, or those of its component parts, go back further than the period of extant texts. Barnabas, a figure from the New Testament. I don't assume that he was a historical figure just on the basis of Christian reports. There's no reports of him outside of Christian literature. In general, I think we should regard the New Testament as literature primarily, and the characters as literary figures. This is a vexed question, of course, but I take the view that the New Testament and surrounding Christian texts should be regarded as literature with historical verisimilitude rather than as solid historiography. In any case, Barnabas is portrayed as a Jewish elder who became a Christian, but he did so after the ascension of Christ, and so he never actually met Jesus. Yet, in the medieval Gospel of Barnabas, this Barnabas, who presents himself as he who writes in the manner of the 4th Gospel, John's Gospel, he's presented as Jesus' closest disciple. That is to say, he presents himself as he who writes as John the beloved disciple, whereas in the New Testament literature, in fact, Barnabas never meets Christ. In the New Testament, Barnabas was, for a time at least, in some tension with Paul and the Gentiles over the question of circumcision. This is an issue in the Gospel of Barnabas, and the Gospel of Barnabas is explicitly anti-Pauline. In later traditions, Barnabas travelled to and died in Cyprus, and still later, a further leg was added to his travels, and he was said to have travelled to Milan and northern Italy. There was a developed Barnabas tradition. This is an accepted veneration in Orthodox Latin Christianity, where Barnabas is regarded as saintly. There was very likely an early gospel written in his name, just as there were gospels written in the name of almost anyone of importance in the New Testament. Importantly, there was an apocryphal Acts of Barnabas written around the 5th century. The church in Cyprus harboured its own independent Barnabas cultus, proper religious sense, since it was an independent jurisdiction. From the 11th century onwards, the church in Cyprus had close contacts with that Barnabas tradition in Milan. When Cyprus fell to the Turks after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, there was an influx of the Barnabas tradition from Cyprus to Milan. Milan was the primary gateway for the Barnabas tradition to enter into European Christendom. The medieval Gospel of Barnabas presents an entirely counter-canonical depiction of this character. In the medieval work, Barnabas is presented as one of the disciples, in fact, the beloved disciple, contrary to the New Testament and all Christian tradition. Here we see the various lists of the 12 disciples from our sources. The Christian tradition has a settled account of who was who, even though the various canonical lists are sometimes hard to reconcile. Notice that Barnabas has replaced Thomas in this list. Thomas is usually paired with Matthew. In the medieval gospel, Thomas is missing, and Barnabas is paired with Matthew. This might suggest perhaps that this work was originally under the name of Thomas, but there are other ways in which it is integral to the name Barnabas. Nevertheless, it's not unimportant that Barnabas replaces Thomas, the twin. It's especially significant in a docetic work where there are questions of mistaken identity. The centerpiece of the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas, or its culmination, is a profoundly docetic crucifixion. God saves Jesus from the cross, and Judas Iscariot is crucified instead. God makes Judas look like Jesus. The image of Jesus is imposed upon him. That is, only the image of Jesus is crucified. That's the central tenet of docetism. This ultimately has its philosophical roots in Platonic dualism, as to many other Christian heresies. That Jesus didn't die on the cross conforms to Muslim expectations, but this work goes much further than that. We find that the author has made a deep and thorough study of Old Testament proof texts in order to show that this version of the crucifixion fulfills Old Testament prophecy. The narrative itself is medieval, melodramatic and almost comical, but the scriptural investigations that underpin it are much more impressive. Somebody with a deep knowledge of scripture, even in a developed tradition, has really thought it through. They demonstrate how the docetic crucifixion fulfills Old Testament prophecy and proof texts. The background of scriptural exegesis is far more intelligent than the extant rendering. There is a substantial body of material in the Gospel of Barnabas that is under obvious Carmelite influence. It might seem strange to us now because the Carmelite order of monks has since been transformed. What we find in the medieval Gospel of Barnabas is a depiction of the primitive Carmelites, the early order. The later Reformed order has only a rough and revised resemblance to it. These monks were followers of Elijah, and by extension, followers of John the Baptist. They were originally located on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, but at the end of the Crusades, they relocated to Cyprus. This confirms the Cypriot link to the Gospel of Barnabas. We find Barnabas traditions mixed with Carmelite material. Where was this likely to happen? The only obvious place is Cyprus. This was the centre of the Barnabas apostolic tradition and the home of the Carmelites. This strongly suggests that the medieval Gospel of Barnabas has material from that provenance. But the primitive Carmelites had trouble fitting into Latin orthodoxy. When Cyprus fell to the Turks, the Carmelites continued their journey into Europe. But they were vegetarians, and they didn't drink wine and had other unorthodox practices. Worst of all, they had no Christian patron. Neither Elijah nor John the Baptist are of the New Covenant. Many in the church were hostile to the Carmelites. To accommodate themselves to Latin orthodoxy, the Carmelites played down their attachment to John the Baptist and developed a particular devotion to the Virgin Mary. And this is typical of Carmelite spirituality today. It's tempting to speculate that the author of the medieval Gospel of Barnabas, or its constituent materials, might have been a disaffected Carmelite from Cyprus. The most surprising thing about the Gospel of Barnabas is that Jesus is portrayed in the role of John the Baptist. John is entirely missing from the narrative. Instead, Jesus is presented as the forerunner to the Messiah. Much of the Gospel consists of John the Baptist material that has been repurposed. Sections of monkish ascetic material where Jesus is preaching in the Transjordan wilderness was originally John the Baptist material. Here, John has been recast as Jesus. This is the most important thing to understand about the content of the Gospel of Barnabas. This was then adapted to Muslim-Christian polemic, and the work became an Islamic gospel. This is easily achieved by making Muhammad the Messiah for whom Jesus is the forerunner, even though this is a malformation, because Muslims do not believe that Muhammad was the long-awaited Messiah. That is a heresy unique or almost unique to the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas. We can see how it has been constructed. The underlying material concerns John the Baptist. It has been adapted clumsily. The origins of the material we find in the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas is in the veneration of John the Baptist. There was a body of heterodox John the Baptist material, at least some of it written by primitive Carmelites. The Barnabas author has taken this material and changed John to Jesus and Jesus to Muhammad, thereby recasting the work as Islamic, or we should say pseudo-Islamic. Let me also say that on any independent reading of the canonical Gospels, and even more of the wider early Christian literature, the most curious thing is the character of John the Baptist. There is obviously much that is being unsaid in this literature. The mysterious figure of John is in the background to the entire story. Veneration of John, who was of the Old Covenant, not the New, continued deep into the Christian tradition, and Christian literature bears all the marks of struggling to reconcile a John tradition with a Jesus tradition. The Medieval Gospel of Barnabas, I believe, bears light upon these questions. The Conclave of 1592. The circumstances that led to the Gospel of Barnabas being leaked into the public domain was the Papal Conclave of 1592. The Papal Conclave of 1592 was very controversial. We need not detail the politics of the time, but Cardinal Giulio Santorio, an inquisitor and canon lawyer, was the candidate endorsed by King Philip of Spain and was expected to be elected, even though he was disliked and feared. The votes, however, were tied, and the deciding vote came down to Cardinal Ascanio Colonna. He too was a vote belonging to King Philip of Spain. But at the last minute, in a dramatic turn of events, Ascanio's brother, Cardinal Mark Antonio Colonna, slipped him a note. Whatever was on the note, it was enough to persuade Ascanio to vote against Santorio, who thereby lost the papacy by one vote. This is the background to the Spanish preface of the Gospel of Barnabas. It has been prepared by the Inquisitor Santorio in revenge for the betrayal at the conclave. And no doubt it served as self-protection, since Santorio's enemies now had the papacy. The publication of the Gospel of Barnabas, or its preparation, was a conspiracy against the Colonna. But the Gospel of Barnabas was, in some form at least, a pre-existing work. It was incriminating evidence that Santorio already had against the Colonna. He also believed that there were accompanying books, heretical books, in the private library of the Colonna and other powerful Roman families. These books are itemised in the preface. Cardinal Giulio Santorio was certainly a man ill-fitted to be pope. He came within a vote of the papacy. Inquisitor and canon lawyer, he was a zealous persecutor of heresy. He made bitter enemies. He believed that heresy extended deep into the church nobility. The soul of the church was at stake in this period. The Protestant revolt had shaken the church to the roots. Turkish advances in the east, the Battle of Lepanto, caused further shockwaves. Santorio was uncompromising, an advocate of cleansing the church of heresy. Had he been elected pope, the Spanish Inquisition would have taken control of the church. Pope Sixtus V. Sixtus V, whose name was Felice Peretti. It was the death of the end of the papacy of Sixtus V that led to the Conclave of 1592. The Spanish preface reports that the Gospel of Barnabas was discovered by Fra Marino in the library of Pope Sixtus V. It is presented as Fra Marino's treasure. Interestingly, this story duplicates the same story actually told in the Gospel of Barnabas concerning Nicodemus and the high priest. In both stories, the hero is with the priest or the pope, who falls asleep in a library at which the hero reaches for something to read to pass the time and by chance pulls from the shelves the treasure which he then steals. Something of the atmosphere of this period is revealed in the story of the 16 Bible. The Church had always used the Bible of Jerome, but the Protestants had exposed it as riddled with textual errors. The Church therefore belatedly appointed a team of scholars to produce a new approved translation. Sixtus V became weary of these scholars and stood them down, deciding to do the job himself. The resulting 16 Bible was an embarrassment. The Pope was not a biblical scholar. The moment Sixtus V died, the Church withdrew his Bible and the scholars went back to work. This is a period of textual intrigues. The important thing for us to note about Felice Peretti is that Marc Antonio Colonna was his protege. Fra Marino was Peretti's nickname for Marc Antonio Colonna. So we know who Fra Marino, the supposed author of the Spanish preface, is. The Colonna family are Roman Church nobility. They claim an ancestry going back to the Roman Empire. They have long been involved in papal politics. In the relevant period, they are a powerful family with members in high places. Both Marc Antonio and his brother Ascanio are cardinals. Marc Antonio was protege of Sixtus V. Ascanio was in the service of King Philip of Spain, who had given him an estate at Aranda. He therefore appears in the incriminating preface as Mustafa de Aranda, his supposed Muslim name. The brothers colluded in the Conclave of 1592 to deny Santorio the papacy. Marc Antonio's home was the commune of Marino near Rome. The Pope nicknamed him Fra Marino. There is a church of St. Barnabas there, and in the front of it there is a fountain with sculptures depicting the Battle of Lepanto. There are many ways in which at least sections of the text of the Gospel of Barnabas might be described as Colonna material. It alludes to events in the 1300s, for example, in which the Colonna were major players. This is evidence that perhaps Santorio was not entirely mistaken. The Colonna were connected with certain traditions that were heterodox, and in this context involved in a particular veneration of St. Barnabas. The Battle of Lepanto 1571 redefined the boundaries between the Muslim and Christian worlds. It was one of the great watersheds in Islamic West history. Most importantly for our purposes, Cyprus was taken by the Turks and it ceased to be a Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. In the wake of this, many groups relocated from east to west. It would seem that the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas is the product of those tectonic shifts and the clash between Islam and Christendom in this period. It is the product of these religious and civilizational conflicts. It is a product of the aftermath of the Battle of Lepanto and the geopolitical changes that it brought. It's worth noting that the boundaries created by the Battle of Lepanto are still contested. Cyprus is still divided. It's important to appreciate the broader movement of ideas behind the Gospel of Barnabas. First, Latin Christians journeyed to the Holy Land during the Crusades. They established the Latin Crusader states that lasted several hundred years. In this way, Latin Christendom was reconnected to the ancient heartland of the Christian and Jewish traditions. At the close of the Crusades, Latin groups found shelter elsewhere. Groups like the Carmelites fled to Cyprus and other islands in the eastern Mediterranean. But then Byzantium fell to the Turks, and in 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, a new dividing line between east and west was drawn, and Cyprus was taken. At this time, groups with their roots in the Crusader states relocated into Europe. They brought with them ancient traditions and often ideas that did not fit comfortably into Latin orthodoxy. The movement of heterodox Barnabas traditions was very likely as follows. Its heartland was Syria and northern Judea. It then moved to Cyprus, especially towards the close of the Crusades. It then moved into Europe, Italy, Milan, when Cyprus was taken by the Turks. This is the general drift of this intellectual history. The Medieval Gospel of Barnabas needs to be placed in this tide of ideas from east to west. The Islamic character of the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas points to the context of the Battle of Lepanto and the surrounding shifts in religious geopolitics. Turning now to samples of the surviving manuscripts. The Italian Manuscript. Here we see a page from the Italian Manuscript. For a long while it was in the collection of Prince Eugene of Savoy. It's now in the National Library of Vienna. The Italian is very irregular and archaic. The linguistic evidence is very conflicting. It's notable all the same that the work is in vernacular. It's very difficult to establish the original language. There is at least one passage, however, that contains Greek, and Greek would be the most likely language of the underlying material. The large periods or dots are a curious typographical feature of the text. Some compare it to similar conventions used for copies of the Quran. But there's no other evidence that the author was familiar with the Quran, so that seems unlikely. We don't know why the author has done this. The spelling is highly erratic. Sometimes the same word is spelt several ways on the same page, far more irregular than most texts. Again, the linguistic evidence of the work is extremely confusing. One scholar offered the assessment that it's the most confusing text in linguistic evidence of any document of the Christian Middle Ages. Here's the Italian manuscript with Arabic margin notes. There are many margin notes in Arabic in the Italian manuscript. Mainly these seem to be translations into Arabic of the chapter rubrics, or else notes that act like rubrics. Their purpose seems to be to help someone, an Arabic speaker, navigate their way around a very large document. Some people have suggested they may be part of an elaborate design and were intended from the beginning to give the document certain associations. The Arabic's not very good. I doubt the Arabic notes were part of the preparation. They were more likely done later, and we can't say by whom or how much later. Here's the Italian manuscript with unfinished rubrics. In some places the chapter rubrics are incomplete. This is very odd. Why is it unfinished? It could only have taken perhaps an hour at most to finish the manuscript. As it survives, there are some chapter rubrics missing. The spaces have been left for them, but the chapter headings have not been added. The Spanish text. There was once a Spanish manuscript, and we have a copy of it, but a large section of chapters is missing. At the bottom of the sample is chapters 121 to 200 are wanting, it says. The Spanish manuscript was lost sometime in the 19th century. A copy of it was only rediscovered in the 1970s, remarkably in a box of books in storage at the Fisher Library at the University of Sydney in Australia. Scholars had made a comprehensive search for it in the libraries of Europe in the early 1900s and found nothing. All the while, it was on the other side of the world. The Fisher Library is the largest library in the Southern Hemisphere. We can establish what occurred. The Spanish text, a copy of the manuscript that is, along with the Spanish preface, was in a collection of books purchased by Sir Charles Nicholson, a resident of New South Wales. Nicholson was a man dedicated to bringing old world culture to the Australian colonies. He was a patron of the arts. Sundry boxes of books he imported from Europe to New South Wales remained unexamined in storage at the Fisher Library until opened by library staff in the 1970s. The Spanish text, with the Spanish preface, was among them. Most likely, Nicholson purchased these books in Dublin, the connection being John Toland, the Irish freethinker who was familiar with the work and considered it a significant aberration in Christian literature. It was free thinkers like Toland who first brought the work to the attention of the general public. Let us remember, though, that free thinkers like Toland were not neutral. Their interest in the work was as ammunition against the Christian religion. Their interest is polemical. So, as well as Islamic Christian polemic, the Gospel of Barnabas has been caught up in other disputations, atheism versus religion, which often prevent us from seeing it in a proper light. When studying this work, we are subject to all the usual distortions and frustrations that come with any highly sensitive religious text.